This madman is a menace to himself and everybody else. He does not belong in Formula One. That was Emerson Fittipaldi, the reigning world champion, the youngest in history at the time. He was talking about a rookie, 23 years old. His name was Jody Scheckter, 1973. Only Scheckter's third Grand Prix start. He was fighting for the lead in France when he crashed into Fittipaldi's car and took them both out of the race. 6 years later, that same rookie stood on the top step of the podium as Formula One world champion, driving for Ferrari. He walked away from racing without a single serious injury. And 38 years after Fittipaldi called him a menace, Scheckter stood in a grandstand in Las Vegas, watching his own son race, begging him to quit before it was too late. What happened in between is not the story anyone expects. Jody Scheckter arrived in Formula One from South Africa with one gear. Flat out, McLaren had given him a handful of chances the year before, and it was already clear he had speed nobody could teach. He was 23 years old, only a few Grand Prix starts into his career, and by his own account, back then, he would have done anything to stay on the grid. He once said that when you are that young and that hungry, you think nothing of the risk. He remembers thinking he would rather be dead than not race in Formula One. 1973, the French Grand Prix. Only his third Grand Prix start, and already he had taken the lead at the start. He was running at the front, fighting for a race most rookies would never even see, when his car came together with the Lotus ahead of him. The impact sent his McLaren somersaulting off the circuit. Both cars were out. The driver in that Lotus was Emerson Fittipaldi, the reigning world champion, who had claimed the title at 25, the youngest in history. Where Scheckter drove on instinct, Fittipaldi drove on calculation. Those who worked with him described a delicate touch, a calm approach that kept him out of trouble, and an analytical mind built as much for tactics as for speed. He studied circuits like homework. He treated a race weekend like a puzzle to be solved, not a fight to be won. Two completely different drivers. Two completely different ways of surviving the same sport. Around the paddock, people were already talking about the kid who had nearly won on his third start. Fittipaldi did not hold back after the crash. "This madman is a menace to himself and everybody else," he told the press. "He does not belong in Formula One." That was the sentence. Said in public, with a name attached, weeks before anything worse happened. Nobody had to wait long to find out if he was right. His very next race, the British Grand Prix, Silverstone. Scheckter had qualified 6th, and by the end of the first lap he was already up to 4th. A soft tire had been swapped for a harder one on the way into the weekend, and he thought it was warmed up by the time the field reached Woodcote, one of the fastest corners on the calendar, taken at around 150 miles an hour. It was not. The back of the car stepped out from under him. He was in the middle of the crash before he even understood what was happening. "The cars just kept hitting him," he said later, "and the cars around him were still crashing. So he put his head down and waited. By some miracle, he was not hurt." 9 cars were eliminated in a matter of seconds. Smoke and dust hung over the track, with wreckage still falling as marshals ran in. It became one of the biggest pileups in the history of the sport. The race was stopped and restarted. Andrea de Adamic, driving for Surtees, suffered a broken leg. It ended his single-seater career. The entire Surtees team was wiped out in that one corner. The Grand Prix Drivers Association demanded Scheckter be banned from the sport. McLaren chose not to ban him. They just made him disappear for a while. His own team manager told him to go back to the motorhome and hide away. So that is what he did. Journalist Denise Jenkinson covered the fallout for Motorsport magazine. He wrote that other teams were making some pretty caustic remarks to McLaren about their hot-headed young South African. But privately, he said, they were wishing they had a driver with that much fire themselves. That is the part that matters. Fittipaldi's warning had just come true, in public, within weeks, in the most spectacular way possible. And it changed nothing. Not the punishment, not the fans, not even Scheckter. He was still the same driver, at the same speed, looking for the same fight. Before Watkins Glen, there was Mosport, the Canadian Grand Prix, second to last race of that same season. Scheckter collided again, this time with a French driver named François Cevert, folding the front of Cevert's Tyrrell into the barrier. Cevert escaped with nothing worse than bruised ankles, though he was furious about it for days afterward. Despite that, Ken Tyrrell signed Scheckter anyway. Jackie Stewart, the reigning three-time world champion, was retiring at the end of that season, and Tyrrell wanted the young South African to take his seat. Starting the following year, Scheckter would be racing as Cevert's own teammate. That partnership would never happen. 2 weeks later, the Formula One season came to Watkins Glen for its final race. It was meant to be Stewart's 100th Grand Prix start, and his last one. During morning practice, Scheckter accelerated out of the pits just as Cevert went past him on track. By the time Scheckter reached the fast uphill section known as the S's, the front of Cevert's car was sitting in the middle of the track. The rest of it was wrapped around the guardrail on the left. He stopped his car. He jumped out and ran toward the wreck. Fire was the thing everyone feared back then, he said later. So running toward a crashed car was automatic. He did not have to think about it. It was already too late. Cevert was gone. The man who would have been his teammate the following season. The same man he had been forgiven for colliding with only 2 weeks before, on a different continent. Around the paddock that day, drivers who rarely showed emotion broke down. Jackie Ickx, not a man known for tears, came back from the crash site in tears himself. Even Fittipaldi, the man who had called Scheckter a menace months earlier, was so shaken he considered walking away from the sport for good. Something in Scheckter changed that morning at Watkins Glen. It was not Fittipaldi's warning in France. It was not 9 cars torn apart at Silverstone. None of that had touched him. It took standing at that guardrail, looking at what remained of Cevert's car, for something to finally get through. From then on, he said, all he was trying to do in Formula One was save his life. Under Ken Tyrrell, the polishing began. Tyrrell was blunt about it. Scheckter had to stop making mistakes. He had to start finishing races instead of leading them for a few laps and disappearing into a wall. The change did not happen overnight, but it worked. Scheckter won 2 Grand Prix in 1974 and finished 3rd in the championship. His aggression now paired with control instead of chaos. He stayed with Tyrrell 2 more seasons, taking a win in each. Then came Wolff in 1977, where he added 3 more wins and finished runner-up in the championship to Niki Lauda. Other teams stopped calling him a wild card. Now they called him a threat. By 1979, Ferrari wanted him. His new teammate was a young Canadian named Gilles Villeneuve, a driver every bit as fearless as Scheckter had once been. Both men lived in Monaco and tested together at Fiorano. They built something rare between teammates. They were honest with each other about everything, down to the smallest setup change on the car, even when the truth cost them something on track. Scheckter would later say that honesty was part of what won them the championship. At Monza, that season, the title was within Scheckter's reach. Villeneuve still had a mathematical chance to fight for it himself. Instead, he sat behind Scheckter's Ferrari for the entire race, watching his back, never once attempting to pass. Scheckter became world champion that day, Ferrari's last champion for the next 21 years, until Michael Schumacher matched it in the year 2000. He retired after the 1980 season, remembered as one of the safest and most reliable drivers on the grid. The same driver Fittipaldi once called a menace had become the version of himself that survives. Saving his life was no longer something he did out of fear. By then, it had become the very way he won. 2011. Scheckter's son, Tomas, was racing an IndyCar. He had made his debut in the series back in 2002, following his father into a life built around speed. Just on the other side of the Atlantic, the Las Vegas Indy 300. 34 cars on the same stretch of track, all bunched together at over 200 miles an hour. Hardly any gap in speed between the fastest driver and the slowest. It was the kind of setup built for spectacle rather than racing. And Scheckter, watching from the grandstand, could see it before it happened. 15 cars went down together. Dan Wheldon was killed. Scheckter was in the grandstand that day, watching. For a long, anxious stretch, he had no idea whether his own son had walked away from it. By then he was a man who spent his days on an organic farm in the English countryside, about as far from a burning racetrack as a former world champion could get. But for those minutes, none of that distance mattered. He was just a father, waiting. Tomas survived. But Scheckter had seen enough. He had wanted him to give up for a while, he said afterward. Hopefully this would knock some sense into him. There was more to life. It really was not worth it. He went further still. One person makes a mistake, he said, and this happens. You should not have to get killed for making a mistake. It was madness. Almost 4 decades earlier, a reigning world champion had stood in front of the press and called Scheckter a menace, to himself and everybody else. A man who only knew one speed. Now Scheckter was saying almost the same thing, in almost the same words, about his own son. Saving his own life was never the whole story anymore. By then, it was his son's life he was trying to save. Fittipaldi had been right, all those years ago. But it was never his warning that changed Scheckter. It never even slowed him down. A guardrail at Watkins Glen did that. It took a death right in front of him, close enough to touch, to do what words alone could never manage. And it took almost 40 years, one full circle, for the man once called a menace, the man who only ever knew one speed, to become the one standing in the grandstand himself, saying the very same warning to somebody he loved.